Good evening and welcome to the world today. This week we discuss the crisis in South Sudan, a crisis which has been building up and which has now reached the proportions of a genocidal struggle between rival factions in South Sudan, which has been in a mess since it became independent in 2011. But we're now at a situation where something has to be done. Things are completely out of control. The killings have increased. The country is in a mess. Oil production came to a rapid end when one faction refused to let the oil wells function, etc., etc. With me is one of the foremost authorities on the region, Mahmoud Mamdani, a professor of government at Columbia University in New York, the director of the Makerere Institute of Social Research in Kampala, and his last book was Saviors and Survivors, Darfur Politics and the War on Terror. Mahmoud, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Let me ask you, was this independence inevitable or could it have been avoided? I mean, I have read some stuff, actually, I think, including from you and others, which suggests that John Garang, the primary leader of the struggle in the South, was still a very late stage for a unified Sudan with a great deal of regional autonomy. And he was killed, assassinated. What was it that happened? Why the desperation to create a separate state? And why did the West back it so enthusiastically?
Independence was not inevitable. If you look at the history of Sudanese nationalism, the first great moment is, of course, the Mahdiya, which is late 19th century, which shook the British Empire. The Mahdi came from central Sudan, but his forces came mainly from Darfur. And there was a very important alliance between these fellows and the Dinka in the south. So the South was present at the very birth of Sudanese nationalism.
Which was the Mahdi's armies against the
Mahdi's
British.
Armies, the killing of Gordon.
General Gordon's death, yeah.
And then the British come, they colonize. If you look at the first major nationalist organization, it's called the White Flag. It was led by two South Sudanese in the British Army, in the British colonial army. One Dinka, the other Nuer. After that, the British decided on a policy whereby the South would be cut off from the North. You would require permissions to go from the North to the South. Arabic was removed from the South. The Christian churches were parceled out, different districts, one under the Methodists, another one under the Catholics, like that. So these were basically nurtured as two completely different countries. And the Southerners were flushed out of the army. Okay. Then if you look at the development of the SPLA, so every major move.
The SPLA is the Sudanese People's Liberation Army, based in the South.
Right, based in the South. So the SPLA organizes basically in the absence of what they think is a fairer deal for the South at independence. Again, the organization of the SPLA is a coming together of leading elements among the Dinka and the Nuer. So every move forward requires a crossing of ethnic lines, right? So there's nothing inevitable about an ethnic civil war. Second thing is that the roots of the civil war are found in the first internal battle inside the SPLA, which is an organization of commanders against John Garang, basically complaining that there are no democratic processes for resolving internal disputes. And Garang is sort of carrying out a solitary show, and he's able to do so because of strong backing from Mengistu Haile Mariam, the Ethiopian state. That's 1991. It results in a massacre
A
of
horrible massacre.
2,000 Dinka, and Machar is involved in that massacre.
Machar is who?
Riek Machar, later to become the vice president and to lead the Nuer militias against the Dinka and Salva Kiir. Machar later apologizes for it, publicly repents, says he was wrong, asks to be forgiven, but that looms large in the public memory and especially the Dinka memory. And many see what happened 2013 as a payback. Now, why payback? Because nothing happened between 91 and 2013 which held anybody accountable for what happened. The idea was simply, let's forget it. Let's forget it. But when the time came, it was in the front space of public memory. There was nothing inevitable about independence before 9/11. Before 9/11, there were many options. There was even nothing inevitable about independence when Garang became vice president
Of the whole of Sudan.
of the whole of Sudan, because Garang was a major believer in a united Sudan. When Garang returned to Khartoum after the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, there were more than 1 million people in Khartoum to receive Garang. It sent shock waves in the Sudanese ruling circles because most of these 1 million were Arabs from the north. And Arabs in the north are not people who came from outside Sudan. Arabs in the north are Sudanese who became not only Muslims, but who took on the language Arabic. And that's how they became Arabs. As their first language became Arabic, they became Arabs. Let's go back to 9/11. With 9/11, the scene changed. The US had invaded Iraq, Afghanistan. Would Sudan be next in the list? This was the big question. If you look at Africa and you look at the countries which seceded after independence, there are only two, Eritrea and South Sudan. In Eritrea, the guerrilla movement won the war. In South Sudan, the guerrilla movement did not win the war.
No.
So why was the solution independence? Because after 9/11, the US, joined by Britain and Norway, known as the Troika, they came in, they addressed the countries in the region, IGAD, 7 countries in IGAD, Interregional Government Authority on Development, a non-political body, but then declared themselves as friends of IGAD, now began to provide military assistance, advice to the SPLA, and put all their influence behind a process that would lead to independence.
So effectively, they encouraged the breakup of the country.
Effectively encouraged, more than encouraged, the breakup of the country.
Actually helped carry
Yeah.
it through.
But also the rulers in the north, in Khartoum, the Islamist party is an important tendency within that party believed that the independence of the south may be better for the north because the south was predominantly non-Muslim, and therefore it would unify the Muslim population in the north. It would create an Islamic country. The entire debate about secularism would be a non-issue because non-Muslims would have left. That didn't happen. So the Machar group goes to Khartoum. When South Sudan begins the negotiations towards independence, 2005, the Machar group returns and rejoins the SPLA in 2002. Meanwhile, the North has created a new army called the South Sudan Defense Forces, which is South Sudanese under Paulino Matip. And that new army is equivalent numbers to the SPLA. And that army returns in 2005. So in 2006, when South Sudan has become autonomous, there's not one army, there are three armies. There's the SPLA, there's the Machar group, and there is the
Northern Army.
The not northern, but northern trained army. It's a southern army. So these are put together. You don't have a single army. What you have is a collection of militias. Right? I was there part of the Commission of African Union appointed Commission of Inquiry. So we asked the Minister of Defense, how many people in this army? So 200,000, 40,000 who have been injured, maimed, whatever, police, 240,000. But nobody really knows because there's no central register. Each militia commander has his own roster, and depending on that roster, collects a salary for the soldiers and dispenses the salary, which means that the phenomenon known as ghost soldiers, soldiers who don't exist except in name, on whose behalf money is being collected, would be rampant.
Dead souls.
Ghost.
Ghosts.
Ghosts. So we don't really know how many soldiers, but we know exactly how many generals.
700.
700 generals, right? 700 generals.
700 generals ruling an army which is supposedly 200,000, but probably much less.
Right. The largest ratio of generals to soldiers of any army in the world.
Ever.
Okay. Now, how do you become a general? To become a general, you form a militia. You form a militia and you fire a few shots. And they say, reconciliation, time for reconciliation. You become part of the National Army. You will become a general. You're completely illiterate. You can't read or write. You become a general. Tell us how many soldiers you have. You'll collect money for them. Okay. So that's the process of formation of this National Army.
Tell me, before we go any further, is what is happening at the moment? We'll delve into the history a bit later. What is happening now that's got you really worried?
What's happening now is accelerated violence perpetrated by a growing number of militias. If you take December 2013 as the beginning of the violence, in December 2013 you had two major groups, one led by the then president and the other by the then vice president, Kiir and Machar. The Kiir group based in Bahr el-Ghazal, the Dinka area, and the Machar group based in Upper Nile, which is the area of the Nuer. The third larger area in South Sudan, which is Equatoria, which is around Juba, sort of watching this fighting going on between the two groups. So what's
both of Christian origin?
Christian or traditional animist, but some Muslims also. There is Islam in South Sudan. So what's happened since then and what is happening now is that militia group formation has spread to the third area, Equatoria. And major commanders have withdrawn from the government army and have become heads of these militias.
Okay, returning to the present now, the situation appears to be out of control with sort of violence, common faction fights going on. Oil production still stopped, or have they resumed it? It's a
trickle.
Trickle of oil flowing through. And you referred in one of your recent texts to a genocidal situation.
That was the UN report, Yasmin Sukha talking about it. So I was simply citing that report. I mean, I know that there is a rhetorical inflation of language.
Yeah. I mean, genocide is a sort of word, Mahmood, which is used so often that it's becoming debased as a concept. Obviously, there are horrors taking place, but genocide.
She wants to attract attention, so she
So
uses
you
the
use
word
the word genocide.
designed to attract attention.
And
I mean, there's a lot of killing of civilian population, yes.
okay.
But whether it's a premeditated attempt to eliminate a particular group, I'm not sure.
So the UN Commission report raises the subject to a global level. The Security Council is divided. The Chinese and Russians want power sharing, the others not. But who is the West backing in this faction struggle? Do they have any particular interest in which group wins and why? By West, we mean the United States.
Let me just backtrack a little bit to give us a better hold on the present situation. Okay. When the negotiations began in 2005, towards what they call a comprehensive peace agreement, the West is in a huge rush to get to independence. So all they are interested in is getting the armed groups together. They rule out of this set of negotiations any group which is politically organized but does not have an armed militia. Right? So effectively they rule out society. They have no interest in building any institutions which will mediate in a power struggle. None whatsoever. So when the power struggle happens, there are no institutions to mediate between struggling parties or to defend society against the fallout of this. Add to that, the day of independence, and I don't know many other instances, an entire UN army is brought in South Sudan. 10,000. 7,000 soldiers, 3,000 administrators and bureaucrats. 10,000 are brought in under a Norwegian former minister, Hilda Johnson, former Minister of Development, right, known as the Secretary General's Special Representative, effectively the governor of South Sudan. We interviewed her and said, what was your job? She said, state building and nation building. I was astonished. She said without blinking an eye. So you have this army brought in at independence. Why? Because what they're expecting is that there will be an attack from the north. That's what they're expecting. But what happens is not an attack from the north, but the factions begin to fight one another. We have a UN camp right there outside Juba and several other camps around the country. What do? Civilians are running. They open their doors, take in civilians, protect them, then they close their doors. And there's a massacre going on outside the gate. They do nothing. It's Srebrenica again. It is Rwanda again. What lesson did they learn? So my question was that, okay, you're talking of accountability. Why shouldn't you hold these people accountable? Why should accountability be limited only to those who hold South Sudanese passports? You've introduced a 10,000 force, 7,000 armed, with the best logistics of anybody in the country. Helicopters, because there's a commission, we were flying in their helicopters. I could see their logistics. And they've come for what they call responsibility to protect civilians. And they haven't done a thing to protect the civilians while a massacre is unfolding. Why shouldn't they be held accountable? Right? So there's this double talk. Now the West, does it have a preference in this fighting? Yes and no. It's completely befuddled. It has no clue what to do. It is simply saying, this is tribalism. But it's not tribalism. I mean, power struggles happen everywhere. The problem here is not a power struggle. The problem is the absence of institutions which would contain the after effects and the effects of a power struggle. And why are those institutions absent? Because these guys wanted an independence as quickly as possible. They wanted secession. So the only thing they could think of was an army. That's it. So here is, you don't have a state here. You have the failure of a transition process. It's not a failed state because the state wasn't there. Right? And who is responsible for that failure? The Troika. US, Britain, Norway. These are responsible. They won't accept that responsibility.
Mahmood, you're suggesting in your article in the New York Times that possibly the only way forward is an African Union basically taking over South Sudan and running it. Now, is this feasible? Because given the divisions within Africa itself, given that one of the United States will find one part, most likely Nigeria, to pick on to do their bidding, how likely is it that this will succeed where others have failed? You know, I look at the botched and disgraceful intervention they made in Haiti with the help of some South American countries. Brazil, Chile got involved in that Haitian campaign. Others stayed out, but the result was a total disaster. What is the guarantee that this won't end in the same way? It will not improve matters.
So we begin with the understanding there is no textbook solution.
No.
Okay.
Because normally you're very hostile to outside
No,
interventions
I am. So I'll work my way to why I make the suggestion I do. First, there's no textbook solution. Second, the option of not doing anything is a non-option. Because if you don't do anything, this thing will resolve itself. I mean, eventually the war has to have a victor. Okay? And that's the usual way of these things getting resolved. But what we're seeing now is a multiplication in the number of militias. We're not seeing one side, dominant. A guerrilla army becoming dominant, etc. So what do we do in the meantime? We've had experiences before. Congo is an interesting case because in Congo, something similar to South Sudan, you have the involvement of neighbors, regions.
Fighting each other through proxy armies.
Right, on two sides.
Yeah.
Angola and Zimbabwe here, Uganda and Rwanda here. Okay, fighting. If you go to South Sudan, the Machar group, if you say who is backing it, Sudan is backing it, the north. Ethiopia is backing it somewhat. You take the Kir group, Uganda is backing it, maybe Kenya, a little bit of backing. So the neighbors, the IGAD countries, neighbors are involved. So that disqualifies them from being part of any forward-looking solution. What happened in Congo was that the troops that came in Kivu province came in from South Africa and Tanzania. And so this is a positive experience because actually the fighting did stop. And they were able to initiate some kind of political process. In the Sudanese case, the African Union put in place a high-level commission on Sudan and South Sudan. It was headed by Thabo Mbeki, former president of South Africa, and had an inner group of sort of intellectuals, practitioners, scholars, all Africans but based in different parts of the world. And its mandate was to engage with different political forces inside Sudan. It worked in Darfur. That was the focal point at that time. And then South Sudan. So you have a group of people with more or less organic understanding of the region, the actors, the social forces, the strengths, the weaknesses. Now, my suggestion was that the first transition was completely militarized and it failed. South Sudan cannot go back to being part of Sudan as a whole.
You think that's impossible?
It's not impossible. It may be possible, but not now, because Sudan has not played a part. So you can't suddenly take it back. So we need another transition, which is a political transition. A transition which understands that the basis of a movement forward is a recognition of political forces inside the country, and it has to be under the leadership of those who are in tune, whose sensibility is in line with this mode of thinking. And I think if the AU has one group, that is the Thabo Mbeki High-Level Commission, which has the experience and the sensibility, and it's worth trying.
You're saying it's worth trying?
Yeah, it's worth trying. That's what I say. Anyway, otherwise, I mean, refugees are flooding into Uganda now. Small arms. South Sudan, there is no country in the world with the density of small arms like South Sudan. When a soldier is, under the Norwegian program, demobilization, when a soldier was demobilized, the soldier kept his gun. He got money, he kept his gun, and he went home. When he finished the money,
he used the gun to get
the gun.
Yeah.
I mean, that place, the soldiers do not stay in barracks. Most soldiers live in civilian areas. It is, small arms proliferation is incredible in South Sudan. And now the wider region is beginning to suffer that with proliferation of refugees.
What if this method which you propose as worth trying doesn't work? Because they're not going in with their armies.
No, they will have to come in. There is a UN force there, still. Right.
The same?
Yes.
Continuation of the same UN force which went in 20...
Yes, it's still there. It's still there. There have been other forces, soldiers brought in from Ethiopia. The Ugandan army is still there. Right. It is supposed to leave, but I believe it hasn't yet really left, not yet. It is involved in the formation of militias in Equatoria region. So there would have to be a force which would have to be from African countries, but not in the immediate region. South Africa, Tanzania, Nigeria, whatever. It would have to be under the political leadership of something like the AU High Command, Thabo Mbeki's High Command. It would have to be funded by the West, especially the Troika, because this is acknowledgement of their responsibility. They created this mess. And I believe they would have an interest in funding it, just to make sure that the mess doesn't get worse.
But he who pays the piper calls the tune.
Well, that's one thing. But, depending on the piper also.
Well, with Trump as the piper, anything is possible, as one of the pipers.
Hey, look. I mean, Trump would be a very interesting piper, because Trump has thrown overboard the entire notion of human rights interventionism. He's very clear. We intervene for our interests.
Yeah, he's telling the truth.
Yeah, he's telling the truth.
Yeah.
We do not intervene for human rights. Away with that. Right.
Mahmood, on that note, we must bring this wonderful interview to an end. Many, many thanks for coming in and enlightening us about what is happening in that part of the world. Thanks.
Thank you for inviting me.